How's it going, MDF?
Welcome back, MDF listeners and viewers. I am your co-host, Joshua Stern.
I'm Brian Dunn.
And welcome to Mostly Dead Folks, the podcast about lives of the past and how we keep them alive today. We've had a little bit of a break. Brian, did you have a nice Christmas time?
Very good. Not a whole lot, but just restful.
Did you stay healthy?
Stayed healthy.
How did you manage that?
I don't know.
Did you put yourself in the bubble?
I was bubble boy. Bubble boy.
My whole family got sick.
Oh.
I just cleared up the bronchitis.
Oh, no.
Wife had the flu. Kids had the flu.
Oh, not good.
Disastrous.
Not good.
But I don't know if you got my text. I did visit, so I had to remind Brian. So again, this is a Florida promotional video. I went to another great state park in Florida, founded by
FDR.
The most overrated president.
He is.
In fact,
It's
at the Ravine Garden State Park. You know what these people did? They built an entire park using federal money during the New Deal, and they built a giant obelisk, a tribute.
Nice.
Can you believe these people? They should have met you.
They should have met me, and I could have talked them off of the roof.
No, sir.
Let's go save the sea turtles or something with that money. I don't know.
It's a great park, though. Highly recommend it. You haven't been there?
No.
It's really cool. You get to go kind of up and down.
I need to go to Warm Springs too, and check out the little White House.
Georgia,
yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. That was where FDR passed away, correct?
Yes, he did.
That's where he passed
That's
away.
another story.
That's
for another
time.
But
Anyway, check out Ravine Garden State Park. Really nice. And while you're there, tip of the cap to the greatest president, or at least maybe not the greatest, but at least not the greatest. It's a bit of a hot take. But at least
is going to have to be an episode.
The most overrated. I think we can all agree.
Okay.
So we are doing this episode here as we approach Black History Month and as we have just come off Martin Luther King Day. We had a long weekend here in honor of Martin Luther King. We wanted to look at moments in the civil rights movement that don't necessarily revolve around Dr. King, I would say. And this is something Brian and I are talking about. Why do you think that's important, Brian?
Because I think, as much as MLK is this figurehead of this movement, this movement was so many other individuals that, again, the whole point of this podcast is that we recognize and keep, alive these people that aren't getting that recognition. So, especially with the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, a lot of it's the youth were really involved. And that's hint where I'm going to go with my story for today.
Absolutely. Sure. Yeah, it's my turn to go first. I do want to say I think it's important to note that, of course, when we commemorate Martin Luther King Day, as I've gotten older, I feel like the legacy of Dr. King is really kind of shrinking in many ways to the point where if people can name one quote from Dr. King, it's probably this. Quote, "I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Of course, this is a laudable and amazing call to action. A year later, the Civil Rights Act, which banishes the Jim Crow system, is signed, then the Voting Rights Act. But Martin Luther King himself, in 1968, famously said, when asked about that, 5 years later, he said, "I must confess that I feel my dream has become a nightmare." Because what he was commenting on is the fact that after those big successes of the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, it became more difficult. Things like equal housing, things like equal employment. These were things that were a harder fight, and Dr. King himself, towards the end of his life, had become disillusioned. So I think while it's important to remember Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech, there's so much more to his life than just the "I Have a Dream" speech.
And plus the racial tension just in general started to kind of, because the black movement kind of splintered.
Sure.
So you had the Stokely Carmichael wing and Black Panthers that were saying, no, this anti-violence of King is just not working out.
True.
If you want your rights and freedoms, you have to maybe punch,
you have to fight for it. Physically fight.
Yeah. Break some windows, punch some faces.
Absolutely.
And that was really, really hard for the Gandhi, Christ-inspired MLK to kind of really take on.
Agreed. So. And it should be noted that at the time of his death, 75% of Americans disagreed with Martin Luther King. So the progress is always a slow-moving process, I think. But we are here to talk about figures other than Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, Brian, have you ever heard of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters?
I think so. It sounds familiar.
So
Sounds familiar.
this is to our ears like, what is a sleeping car porter? So if we go back to the late 1800s, a guy named George Pullman creates what's called the Pullman sleeping car. And this is like the height of luxury. When you're going cross country to hang out in California, if you've got money, you are in the sleeper car. The porters were almost universally black, and they were the ones who were responsible for setting up the beds, cleaning up, and so on and so forth. They're one of the earliest unions. And in fact, if you go back to 1894, there's a big strike at the Pullman factory by the ARU, the American Railway Union. And this creates a big national sort of uproar. And on June 28th, 1894, Labor Day was created by President Cleveland. So yeah, we got the thumbs up. I don't know where this thumbs up comes from.
Just go with it. It's support.
Thumbs up to Labor Day. But it should be noted, a week after signing that proclamation recognizing the rights of workers and their importance in the American society, he sends the National Guard in to break up the protest, and 30 protesters are killed, and the strike is ended. Now, I bring this up because there is a man you may have heard of named A. Philip Randolph.
Yes.
So if you have ever gone to a Jaguars game or Florida, Georgia, you've probably tailgated or at least walked up and down A. Philip Randolph Boulevard. A. Philip Randolph is a native son of Florida, and he is actually the guy who leads the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters about 20 years after this strike. And he becomes the first, they're the first black union recognized in the United States. So already this guy, A. Philip Randolph, clearly putting his money where his mouth is and really fighting the good fight. People don't know about him as much because he was behind the scenes. He was not out front like a Malcolm X or a Martin Luther King, but he was incredibly influential. In fact, the first time maybe people have heard of him, the first big sort of victory he earns is the Executive Order 8802. Now, this is signed in 1941 by your boy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So through constant pressure, and this would be an argument in your cap about how maybe FDR isn't as sort of racially progressive, FDR does not really want to do much on the black issue because it's during World War II. America must be unified. And in fact, FDR, in a meeting with A. Philip Randolph meets with him and says, hey, FDR, we, black Americans, we want to participate in the war effort. We want to work in the government. At that point in time, the federal government is totally segregated. So he wants to have a desegregation of the federal workforce. FDR says in a secret recording, quote, Mr. Randolph, we can't have 100,000 black people marching on Washington. You can't control them. You might have bloodshed and death. Not FDR's finest moment. But I will say to his credit, and more importantly to A. Philip Randolph's credit, Randolph threatens to march on Washington to show disunity at a time when the government is desperate to project unity. He ends up caving, and he passes Executive Order 8802, which is truly the first victory in the civil rights movement. A lot of people talk about Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier. This is 5 years before that. And that never happens without A. Philip Randolph. 20 years later, he organizes, with the help of Martin Luther King, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which is where Martin Luther King, of course, gives his I Have a Dream speech. All of that organization is behind the scenes, so while MLK is the face of this movement, it doesn't happen without the hard behind-the-scenes work of an A. Philip Randolph, going all the way back to, in the 1890s, even before he's on the scene, the desire to unionize. And I will leave you with a quote. In that same conversation with FDR, A. Philip Randolph said, of black Americans, Mr. President, quote, they feel they are not wanted in the armed forces of this country, and they have earned the right to fully participate in the nation's working life. So without him, without A. Philip Randolph, who knows where we're at in the civil rights movement, an incredibly important figure and a local figure here in Northeast Florida. So the next time you're at a Jags game and you see A. Philip Randolph Boulevard, you will know the history of it.
Now, did he have a connection to Truman? Because Truman goes and desegregates the military.
Yes, he also works on that. He does work on that as well, though he doesn't have, at that point, because, that's a great question, because the workforce had been desegregated, it becomes slightly easier for Truman to desegregate. Truman had tried to legislate the desegregation, but that was blocked by Southern white Democrats who wanted nothing to do with it. So he had to do the executive order. And of course, as you know, during Korea, it's democracy versus evil communism. We're probably not much better than the communists if we refuse to treat our black soldiers equally.
Absolutely.
So that had a lot to do with it as well. What you got?
Montgomery bus boycott.
Love it.
What's the figure that you think of?
Of course, Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks, right?
Sure, of course.
Well, what if I told you, because that happened on December 1st, 1955, what if I told you that there was an earlier Rosa Parks?
I would say I'm aware of it, but I don't know how much our viewers and listeners are.
Okay. So we have in March of 1955, we have a 15-year-old girl named Claudette Colvin, and she boards a bus, is going to sound very familiar, boards a bus, and back then, with the Montgomery segregation policy, blacks had to go to the back, whites in the front, and if a white boarded the bus and a black was in, let's say, a middle seat, they had to give up that seat for the white. Sure. So, and on comes a white woman. She's described as young, not pregnant or anything like that, not elderly. And so when this happens, the bus driver's back up to a few black passengers. They do, but still this one young lady, Claudette Colvin, who recently, I'll just say, she just died recently, actually, January 13th, 2026. But she refused, and she didn't understand, well, there's an open seat next to me across the aisle, but again, optics, you can't do that because then it would be that they're equals. And so the bus driver keeps saying, you gotta move. And she reflected on this years later and said that she felt like she had on one shoulder Harriet Tubman and on the other shoulder Sojourner Truth pushing her down and refusing. And it's interesting because in school, she's a high school student, in school, she had been taught about constitutional rights and liberties, and she started to shout back, I know my rights, So long story short, she gets arrested. And as the police are removing her, there's some kind of her take versus their take. Some witnesses say she was, disorderly. Some, in Colvin's mind, she thought she went limp and just kind of, there you go. But she was charged with disturbing the peace, breaking the segregation law, and assaulting officers. And a judge goes and drops the first two charges and only keeps the assaulting officers. And the reason why behind this is because the judge, you can kind of see where this is going, the judge didn't want this to become an appeals case where now they can appeal. This is kind of a foot in the door to appeal the segregation law of the bus system. Now, very scary for a 15-year-old to do this because she remembers that she was in the back of this police car and she remembers that she was mocked by the police officers and even really they made suggestive comments about her body to the point that she was really nervous for her safety. She put her hands kind of in her lap and just started reciting literature and prayers from the Bible, like Psalms, anything just to kind of keep her mind, off of the tense situation. So here's the question for you guys and for you, Josh. Then why not have her be the Rosa Parks? Because this happens 9 months earlier. Here you go. Here's that. Here's a young person that stood for her rights and was arrested because in the past, women had done this, passengers had done this, and they were just fined and then removed off the bus quietly. It was very quietly. Sure. Well, here is Colvin kind of, standing her ground. Well, community leaders said that she was, quote, too feisty and, quote, uncontrollable. And they were they were also worried about her age. They also were worried about the fact that she lived on the wrong side of town, and that she had too dark of a skin complexion. So again, there's the idea that if this is going to be the poster child of this movement so that we can kind of bring about change, this might turn off America and turn off others. And so this kind of leads to eventually Rosa Parks being chosen because Rosa Parks had fairer skin, looked like a middle-class woman, middle-aged, and just kind of looked the part for what they were
seemed more
going for.
sympathetic.
Yes, there you go. So, so that's kind of the sad thing for Colvin, is that Colvin, she is super important because she is going to be brought in on a case, a federal case, Browder versus Gale in 1956, which ultimately leads to the overturning of segregation in the Montgomery bus system. So as much as Rosa Parks gets credit, we've got to highlight also Colvin. Colvin also, was actually a mentee of sorts to Rosa Parks. Mm-hmm. So Rosa Parks was her mentor. She really took Colvin under her wing, was kind of letting her be a secretary of a youth group in terms of a civil rights movement. But again, for Colvin, she wasn't angry that she kind of was overlooked by history, but just kind of disappointed that she was never really recognized. Her charge of assaulting officers was later thrown out after some 66 years. And as I mentioned, she recently passed away. And so I think, we should recognize, especially as I said earlier at the top of the podcast, that the youth were really, really big. Yes, we hear these bigger names like Abernathy and King, but the youth were really the ones that were kind of putting themselves in risky situations. We all know with like the fire hoses and the dogs and all those terrible scenes that literally made Kennedy nauseous watching them, just like the rest of America. So the youth should be recognized. Colvin should be recognized, and that's what I wanted to do.
And I think Brian and I have both talked about, when we talk about civil rights, there is this association with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, which predominantly revolved around the rights of African Americans. However, the concept of civil rights go far beyond just our black brothers and sisters, of course. It's the idea of protecting individual liberties in the face of oppression and agitating when necessary.
Right.
I believe we have a question, yes?
Yes. So we'll end today's episode with a question from the middle school.
Here we go.
And this is from TJ.
Okay.
Here we go. You ready? It's kind of a broad one, so I don't want to hear.
Right.
He wants to know, why do empires rise and fall?
Whoa! TJ.
In a nutshell.
It's going to be a very generic response. I would say that the through line of the collapse of all empires is when they get too big for their britches. When empires go from whatever their core founding values may be to expanding beyond that, usually for avarice and greed and a desire to claim lands that they don't necessarily have any sort of claim over. Yeah. I think we see in Russia, we see this desire of Vladimir Putin to reconstruct the Soviet Empire. And of course, the reason the Soviet Empire collapses, one of the many reasons, besides Rambo, of course, one of the many reasons that the Soviet Empire collapses is a lot of the people within this empire have nothing in common with Moscow. Like Poland, for instance, devoutly Catholic, don't speak, don't have the Cyrillic alphabet, for example, feel totally divorced from Moscow, and they resist. Of course, solidarity movement, the kind of the beginning of the end in some ways for the Soviet Union happens in Poland. And that's just one example. I think we can look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which also had subsumed all these different religious and linguistic and cultural groups. It does not make for a kind of cohesive unit to do that. So I would say that's a very broad question, and I thank you for it. I would just say that generally when empires get too big, Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, all these things.
Let me
in my view,
shrink it down.
Sure.
Do you think that empires fall apart from within or without?
I think history teaches us that usually the collapse begins within, and then stronger outside powers clean up the mess. We saw this with the Romans and the Visigoths, right? If you go back to the early days of the Roman Empire, the Visigoths, they're not even sniffing the Roman doorway, and yet as infighting and expansion and lack of money drains the Roman Empire of its blood and treasure, the Visigoths just walk in. So I think internal strife is usually the main. I mean, there's external factors, the Soviet Union, of course, Reagan just spending them into oblivion, the Afghan war. There's always kind of external factors, but I think generally the fractures begin internally and then they collapse externally.
Gotcha.
So I think you have to stay strong inside of your country and making sure voices are heard. And sometimes things like the civil rights movement are needed. To when things have gone beyond, they are needed to make that empire or that country stronger again by reasserting its values.
Absolutely.
In my view.
Absolutely.
So TJ, I hope that helps. What would you say to that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think I agree with you in the sense that you kind of start to see the cracks in the foundation from within, especially with Rome, with their emperors and
you know much more about that than I do. So please.
Well, yeah, it's just the fact that, again, I agree. I mean, if you look at the Macedonian Empire, if you look at the Persian Empire, Roman Empire, they do get a little too big, and I teach my students that an emperor can't do it all on his own, and so you kind of have to delegate power.
Indeed.
But then when you do that, people kind of go, "Ooh, this is kind of nice," and then that's where, if we look at the Macedonian Empire after Alexander the Great dies, it literally splits into three parts because he doesn't have an heir, who's going to take over? So that's a perfect example of. It wasn't that they had an outside threat exactly. It was something within that they couldn't agree on who's going to be taking charge now. Well, let's just divide the empire up. So this great, massive empire is now broken apart. So
very good.
I totally agree.
And now the sun's come out, just as we finish. Maybe that's a sign.
There you go.
I hope you've all enjoyed this most recent episode of Mostly Dead Folks. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe, like the page. We're on Spotify now as well as YouTube. Thank you to our wonderful producer for sorting that out for us. And we're always open to suggestions. What would you like to hear us discuss? And we love your questions as well, so please leave those in the comments, or you can email myself or Mr. Dunn. But until next time, signing off, Joshua Stern.
Brian Dunn.
Have a great day, everyone.
Take care.